Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources here today,
We do.
and we're looking into something that maybe on the surface sounds a bit simple, possibly even, negative learner errors in language learning.
Right. The mistakes people make.
Exactly. But our mission today, really drawing from these studies, is to completely flip that view.
Turn it on its head.
Yeah. We're going to unpack why these errors, they aren't just, well, frustrating slip-ups. They're actually incredibly powerful tools.
Tools, yeah. Like clues or maybe maps
Or even little diagnostic tests, you could say. They tell us so much about how language is learned.
and how we can teach better or learn better ourselves.
Absolutely. So this is really for anyone interested in language. Maybe you're an educator, grading papers, or a parent helping with homework.
We're just curious,
Mm.
curious about that whole messy process of picking up a new language.
Get ready, because some of these insights, they could really change how you see those red marks on a page or
Right.
those stumbles in conversation. Okay, so let's dive right in, because the sources, they really push for this a fundamental shift in thinking. What are errors, anyway?
Yeah, let's define that first. The core idea here, and it's really underlined in the research we looked at,
Mm-hmm.
is that learner errors are absolutely not random failures. That's critical.
Okay, not random. So what are they?
They're systematic. They actually reflect how a student is actively, you know, processing the language.
Actively processing, hypothesizing.
Exactly. Building their understanding of how the language system works. It's an active construction process.
So it's not just being careless or, I don't know, lazy.
Not at all. We need to contrast this with what we might call mistakes or slips.
Okay.
Those are usually just performance issues, like you knew the right word, you knew the rule, but maybe you were tired or distracted.
A slip of the tongue, basically.
Precisely. Errors, though, they run deeper. They actually give us a window into the learner's interlanguage.
Interlanguage, right? I remember that term. That's like their own unique, evolving version of the language they're learning, the one inside their head.
Exactly that. It's their current internal grammar. It's the set of rules they've sort of figured out based on everything they've heard and tried to say.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Think about an error like, um, he goes to school yesterday.
Right. A classic one.
It isn't just proof they don't know English, right? It's actually a fascinating glimpse into their current grasp of past tense.
How so?
Well, they clearly understand something about past time. The word yesterday is there.
Okay, yeah.
Their internal rule at that moment might be something like, okay, add a time word, but the verb itself maybe doesn't change. Or perhaps they just haven't solidified that past tense marking yet.
So it shows they are applying some kind of logic.
Yes, it's a logical step in their own learning process. They're trying to apply a rule, even if it's not the standard English one yet. It shows active work.
Wow, okay. That completely reframes it. It's not a failure sign, but a sign of, well, processing, progress even.
Exactly. Progress towards building the full system.
Okay, so if errors are systematic, if they show us this interlanguage,
Mm-hmm.
why do they happen? The sources really went into the root causes, didn't they?
They did, and understanding the source makes them even more valuable as tools.
Diagnostic tools you mentioned.
Incredibly powerful ones. The research points to a few key reasons. One really big one, especially in contexts like, say, Thailand, which some papers focused on, is first language interference, L1 transfer.
Ah, so how their native language, their Thai in this case, influences their English attempts.
Precisely.
Mm.
And it's not always a negative interference, like getting in the way.
Right.
It's more that their deeply ingrained L1 habits shape how they try to structure English.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like some sources noted Thai speakers might omit subjects in English, saying something like, go to school yesterday.
Ah, because you can often do that in Thai if it's understood.
Exactly. Or they might struggle with English tenses because Thai marks time differently, often using adverbs rather than changing the verb form itself. Their L1 patterns are just naturally transferring over.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. What else did the sources point to? Other common causes?
Another very common one is overgeneralization. This is where a learner correctly learns a rule, but then applies it too broadly.
Like applying it everywhere, even to exceptions.
Yes. The classic example is adding ed to every verb for the past tense.
Like saying comed or good.
Exactly. Calmed instead of came.
Mm-hmm.
They have learned the general rule ed for past tense like walked, talked. That's success.
Right.
The error calmed isn't random. It shows they're actively applying that rule they learned. They just haven't mastered the irregular exceptions yet. It's evidence they're trying to make the language systematic.
That's fascinating. It actually proves they have learned something and are trying to use it.
Right. Then, of course, there's incomplete learning. Sometimes a rule just hasn't been fully grasped, or maybe there hasn't been enough practice to really solidify it.
Makes sense. You mentioned another one, transfer of training. That sounded interesting.
Yeah, that one's quite insightful, raised in some of the pedagogical studies.
How can the teaching cause errors?
Well, sometimes errors can be an unintentional consequence of how the language was presented or practiced.
Like,
Maybe the explanation was confusing, or perhaps there was too much focus on drilling just one pattern without contrasting it enough with others. Or, the materials themselves might inadvertently lead to a misunderstanding.
so the way it's taught could actually set up certain errors.
It can happen. It's a good reminder for educators that learner errors can sometimes provide feedback on our instruction too.
So keeping track of errors isn't just about diagnosing the learner.
Right, it can also help us reflect on and maybe refine our teaching methods.
That's a really useful point. And you mentioned a practical tip from the sources.
Yeah, just the simple value of keeping some kind of log of recurring errors, whether you're a teacher noticing patterns in a class or a learner tracking your own common mistakes.
Pattern recognition.
Exactly. That's key to understanding the likely cause, which then points towards the best way to address it.
Okay, this leads perfectly into the big why. The power of analysis. Why bother going to all this trouble to analyze errors systematically?
Well, this is where the real value proposition comes in, right?
Yeah.
For teachers, as we touched on, it's just such a powerful diagnostic tool. It lets you move beyond just marking something wrong.
To understanding why it's wrong.
Precisely. Identifying that specific learning gap. And that allows you to tailor your instruction much more precisely to what students actually need. It makes teaching way more efficient.
You're responding to data, not just guessing.
Exactly.
And what about for the learners themselves? What's the benefit for them in understanding their errors?
Oh, it's huge. For learners, understanding their own patterns helps build crucial self-awareness, metacognitive skills.
Thinking about their own thinking, basically.
Yes. When you start to see the systematic nature of your own mistakes, you can become much more focused in your learning. You start asking, okay, why did I make that error? And then you look for the correct pattern.
So errors become something the learner can actively learn from, not just something to avoid or have corrected.
Absolutely. It really fosters a growth mindset. Errors stop being these embarrassing things
Yeah, things to hide.
and start being seen as evidence of effort, evidence of progress, really, steps on the journey. Each error is a data point about your learning.
And this analysis helps tailor the learning experience too, differentiated instruction.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
It's essential for effective differentiation and scaffolding. If you understand the specific error patterns in a group, or even for an individual.
You can adjust the support.
Exactly. You tailor your support, your materials. We read one account, a case study, where a teacher analyzed student writing.
Mm-hmm.
Noticed this widespread pattern of subject-verb agreement errors. So instead of just marking them all wrong,
She changed her lessons.
yeah, she restructured the next few lessons to specifically target that grammar point using different activities. That's teaching informed by real student data, not just following the textbook blindly.
Okay, I'm sold on the why. Analysis is crucial. But let's get practical. How do you actually do error analysis? What steps did the sources suggest?
Right, the how-to. The practical guides we looked at laid out a pretty clear process. First step, collect data.
Makes sense. Where from?
Well, the sources suggest looking at various types of learner language. Writing samples are great things like journals, assignments, portfolios. They give you one kind of insight.
Into more planned language, maybe?
Often, yes.
Yeah.
But spoken language is equally important.
Right. Conversations, presentations.
Exactly. Recordings from presentations, group discussions, even more structured speaking tasks. They offer different insights, maybe into errors that pop up under pressure or in more spontaneous speech.
So looking at both written and spoken gives a fuller picture.
Definitely. A more complete view of their interlanguage system.
Okay, so you've collected the writing samples, the recordings. Then what? It could seem like a lot of, well, errors.
Then you start categorizing the errors.
Yeah.
You need to group them somehow to see the patterns.
What kinds of categories did the sources suggest?
Common ones include morphosyntactic errors. These are grammar issues, word forms, sentence structures.
That's the he-go example. Verb tense,
Yeah.
subject-verb agreement, word order.
Exactly. Then there are lexical errors, vocabulary problems.
Using the wrong word.
Using the wrong word, like saying he was fun when you mean funny, or issues with false friends.
Yep.
Those words that look similar in two languages but mean different things.
Got it. What else?
Phonological errors, pronunciation issues, often linked to L1 influence or just challenges with specific English sounds,
Okay.
and also pragmatic or discourse errors. These are about using language appropriately in social situations.
Like being too direct or not connecting ideas smoothly.
Precisely. Issues with politeness, register, or how sentences and paragraphs flow together.
Okay, having those categories helps organize things. And then you track them. You mentioned tracking earlier.
Yes, tracking is key. You need to see which errors are frequent, which are persistent. Simple tools can work: a spreadsheet, a notebook, checklists,
For an individual learner or for a whole class?
both.
Hmm,
It helps you see if an error is just a one-off slip or if it's really part of their systematic interlanguage because it keeps showing up.
that makes sense. And you mentioned involving the learners themselves. Some sources suggested that.
Yes, several pedagogical articles really emphasize this. It can be very powerful.
No.
Things like having learners keep feedback journals. They review their own corrected work, reflect on the errors. This process really boosts their
So
awareness.
they become more conscious of their own patterns.
Exactly. It empowers them to take ownership of their learning. They become active participants in analyzing their own language development, not just passive recipients of correction.
That's a significant shift from the teacher being the sole judge to the learner being an active analyst. Okay, so we've collected, categorized, tracked. Now, the really important part. How do we turn this analysis into actual teaching strategies or learning strategies?
Right. This is where the analysis pays off, using it to actually improve things. The sources offer a bunch of practical strategies. One obvious one is designing targeted lessons.
Based on the frequent errors you found.
Exactly. If subject-verb agreement keeps popping up for a group, you build specific lessons, activities, study sessions around that point. You address the need directly.
So you're letting the students' real needs, shown by their errors, guide your lesson planning.
Yes, it's responsive teaching. Another effective strategy is using error correction tasks.
Instead of just marking things wrong.
Right. Design activities where learners actively find and fix errors. Maybe using anonymous sentences from classmates.
Oh, that's a good idea. Less pressure.
Or peer review sessions focused on certain error types. Or specific sentence repair exercises. It gets them thinking actively about the rules.
That sounds much more engaging, yeah, than just getting a marked up paper back.
It encourages that active processing and checking their own hypotheses about the language.
Yeah.
You can also create focused practice.
Drills, basically.
Targeted drills, yeah. Exercises that specifically isolate and practice those structures or vocabulary items that you know are error-prone for that learner or group.
Mm.
If irregular past verbs are the issue, you focus practice right there.
And the way feedback is given matters too, right? It's not just about marking.
Absolutely crucial. The research really stresses that reinforcing feedback through revision is key. It's not enough just to highlight an error.
The learner needs to understand why and how to fix it.
Exactly. This can involve different techniques, things like recasts, where you subtly rephrase what the learner said correctly without stopping the flow, or clarification requests like, sorry, did you mean? Which prompts them to think and maybe self-correct.
Okay.
Or even brief metalinguistic feedback, a quick explanation of the rule involved. The goal is always to help them internalize the correction and the underlying pattern.
Giving them the tools to eventually self-correct more often.
Precisely. And that idea of using anonymous error samples from the whole class for group reflection or correction activities, that can be really powerful.
Yeah, creating a shared learning moment without singling anyone out.
Exactly. It normalizes errors as part of learning and focuses on the language itself.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway here? What does this deep dive tell us overall?
I think it clearly shows that learner errors are, well, truly invaluable guides. They're not just problems to swat away and forget.
They're more like maps.
Exactly. Maps showing us exactly where the tricky parts are in the learning journey, and, crucially, showing us where to focus our efforts next, whether we're teaching or learning.
So the advice is start noticing those patterns in your own language learning maybe, or in the language of people you're helping.
Yes, analyzing them, even just making a mental note or a quick written note of recurring types. It might just be one of the most powerful tools you have.
For speeding up language learning and just becoming, a more effective communicator or teacher.
Absolutely.
Okay, that brings us to our final thought. A question for you, the listener, to consider. This came up implicitly in some of the discussions we read. If errors really show us the process of learning, those steps being taken towards getting better, what does that tell us about the whole idea of perfection in language learning? Should perfection even be the ultimate goal?
That's a great question to chew on. What role does perfection play if the journey, the errors, tells us so much?
Something to think about for your own learning or your teaching?